Coming to today to talk to you guys about civil rights. I've already recorded this once, but it was like 45 minutes. I'm going to try to cut that by at least 20 minutes today, which means we are going to, by and large, emphasize racial equality today. We're going to focus on the civil rights movement as we speak about civil rights. So, a couple of things to take into consideration as we begin this presentation. First and foremost, what are civil rights? Civil rights protect an individual from discrimination based on their race, their national origin, their gender or sex, and then these other characteristics, things that we're generally born with, or just things that we don't tend to choose, right? And the hope being that laws and policies should treat us all equally. We are a nation that prides ourselves on a couple of different things. First, natural rights, right? That's one of our foundational principles. Is this idea that every person is born and has these rights that you know everybody should respect. The second piece being that we are equality of opportunity, right, is a major driving force in this idea that like we expect and anticipate everybody to have the same chance to succeed. We don't necessarily say that you're going to have the same outcome, but certainly that you're going to have the same opportunity. So when you start looking at civil rights and you start taking those principles into consideration, that's all super important. So as we move forward, I'm just going to use my keyboard now because obviously this is getting ridiculous. So our learning objectives. What are we expected to know by the end of this conversation? So first and foremost, explain how constitutional provisions have supported and motivated social movements. Right there, we're going to be really focused on the 14th Amendment. Number two, policymaking interests explain how the government has responded to social movements. Number three, constitutionalism explain how the court has at times allowed the restriction of the civil rights of minority groups and at other times has protected those rights. So that's what we're going to be focused on. So what are we talking about today? We will be primarily discussing the efforts of the government and social movements. Um, People of diverse backgrounds and their efforts to fight and at times against for or against civil rights, right? So we aren't going to get to a ton of this other stuff, which is tough, but again, we're just going to focus on civil rights and the civil rights movement. So to begin with, I'm just going to touch on this. Basically, the idea is that Americans with disabilities are considered a protected group under the 14th Amendment. That's why if you go to a post office, the Americans with Disabilities Act was, there was protests. People had to be taken into consideration. There was a lot of movement and a lot of advocacy. You had interest groups being involved in this as well. And eventually legislation will get passed in the 1970s and again in the 1990s. The major act being the Americans with Disabilities Act. So our big driving focus here today is going to be civil rights and the civil rights movement and the relationship between those two things. Just because it's the most illustrative example that we have. So to begin with, it's good to understand that from the time that our nation started till about 1865, uh, our policy, our national policy, not that this was effective in all states. Many states banned slavery, but for the most part, the national government was okay with people owning other people. They would work for free. Sure, they'd have housing provided to them, which was awful housing. It wasn't like they were sleeping in the mansion. They were sleeping on dirt floors. They would be provided with food. Great. It wasn't good food. And they were done. They were held against their will. It was violent at times, very violent. And it's just a terrible mark on our history, right? Like slavery is something that we can all agree human rights catastrophe, just an absolute dark, dark moment in our history. So moving forward, finally, we have the Civil War. You have a really, really important moment in 1865 after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, where we're not quite sure what's going to happen, right? Like, we don't know because Lincoln was the driving force. You have this group called the Radical Republicans in there as well, who are sort of fighting for the rights of what were called quote unquote freed men. Obviously, these were the blacks who were no longer under the subjugation of legally under slavery. Now, were they still technically Slaves, I would argue, yes, whether that was through the farming practices that were done, or whether that was through black codes or Jim Crow laws, which really emphasized trying to arrest free blacks for things that weren't really crimes. So people ask why, because the 13th Amendment frees all people from slavery. However, there's an exception. The only time slavery is legal is once you've been arrested. So if you've been arrested, you've been imprisoned, especially in the 1870s, 1880s, 1860s, that whole time frame, you saw people who were arrested and then who were sold off to a company, and they were forced to work for those companies, really without pay until their time in prison was up, and the jails made money off of selling those people to the companies, and then the companies didn't have to pay them. The most important thing for us to consider, though, is the 14th Amendment right now, which is, the equal protection amendment. And we talked about there's a due process, so we start seeing selective incorporation as well. But this is the part of the 14th Amendment we need to know when related to civil rights. It's this idea of the equal protection clause, meaning that regardless of your race, regardless of your sex, regardless of any of these characteristics, you get the same rights under the law as the next person would. As people, somebody who, like, if we stereotypically said white people had the vote, white people could do this, white people could do that, you get all of those too as well. And for the 14th Amendment. 15, voting rights. This was supposed to provide people with the opportunity to get out and vote. However, voter subjugation and voter rights violations happened regularly. So, moving forward. The first, this is not considered a landmark case by the AP board, but it's a wildly important case for us to understand because it sort of shows that concept, that whole standard when we're looking at the idea of like the Supreme Court changing over time, that third standard I mentioned. Um, Plessy versus Ferguson is a great example of a case that where the Supreme Court literally took the stance that here's a quote directly from the case, from the majority opinion: social prejudices cannot be overcome by legislation. That whole idea that we can't, racism is going to exist and there's nothing we can do about it, so just don't do anything about it. The reason why Plessy versus Ferguson is truly important is because it creates this idea within the Constitution, but not within the Constitution, excuse me, within the legal system, that separate is equal. Like, that black kids can have a school, white kids can have a school, black people can have a drinking water fountain, white people can have a drinking water fountain. It's this crazy um, piece of our history which basically legalized racism. Um, and this gentleman to the right is Homer Plessy, and Homer Plessy was like 1/8 black, I believe. But everybody knew what was happening when he was trying to test this law. I believe it was a train, an issue with trains. He tried to ride in a white car. Somebody knew, like, it was sort of known that he was going to try to test this, so he was arrested. And then the court saw and basically decided in favor of segregation. So that's, the Supreme Court, our government took a stance that segregation was totally legal and totally cool. So for the most part, and especially in southern states, that leads us to see laws passed, which are known as Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow is a song from the 1800s during the vaudeville sort of racist blackface moment in U.S. history entertainment. Uh, Jim Crow is a very stereotypical, stereo. I don't know how I want to say this. Um, Assumption of what a black person was, right? Incredibly racist idea. But the laws themselves were really focused on creating separation between white folks and black folks, and really emphasizing the idea that black people are inferior and white people are superior, and therefore should receive benefits to society. Whether that's like the buses stopping, at every white person's neighborhood corner, but refuses, like, the bus stops are the bus stops, and those are the only bus stops you can get on in the black neighborhoods. Whether that's you have to walk on the right side of the street, or if you're black, you better tip your hat to a white man, otherwise he may punch you in the face. So it's both legal rights and it's also sort of these social behaviors as well. No interracial relationships, even though that was legitimately on the books in some of these states as well. So that leads us to 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education case. This is a mandated case. You guys are going to be looking at this. You guys have that assignment already. But the Brown versus Board of Education case is wildly important because it overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. This is where we see the major shift in in the government sort of backing the free rights of African Americans. So basically, I think this can be summarized in a sweet quote here. We can conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And we've seen this in social experiments, as you guys saw in the book. That whole idea that regardless of who you were, if you had a brown doll, that brown doll wasn't as favored as the white doll, right? These are things that these are institutional. It's institutional racism, and it really provides a really, really important look at why these things matter so much because it can affect your self worth as a child. It can affect how, what kind of jobs you can get later on in life. So it eventually, it affects your quality of life at the end of the day. So Brown versus Board of Education is a huge step in the right direction. We see the executive branch helping enforce that law. We see Dwight Eisenhower calling out the National Guard in order to support students entering schools. We see laws being passed. Now, that doesn't mean states weren't fighting against that. I mean, you legitimately had southern states who, in places like Little Rock, Arkansas, who downright refused, and that was where Eisenhower called in the National Guard as well, but who just wouldn't desegregate. So you will see some additional shoe drops later as well. So when do we start seeing sort of the main people who we understand in the civil rights movement? December 1955, you have the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, which was an incredibly important and pivotal moment in the civil rights movement when you have Rosa Parks, who is just this admirable, incredible citizen, highly respected within her community, performs this act of civil disobedience, which basically means that you're going to break a law that you consider immoral. So in Montgomery, they were basically preventing people from getting on the bus in certain places. Black people had to get on the back of the bus, had to walk to the front of the bus to pay, and then were forced to sit sort of in the back of the bus again. And Rosa Parks said, "Screw that." They had this whole setup. Sort of, she was acting not by herself, but as a representative for the larger group, right? And this leads to her being removed from the bus, her being arrested. There's a great picture of her getting locked in, and her mugshot, and she's just very clearly a patriot in every sense of the word. So she breaks this law that's immoral. This is where we actually begin to see Martin Luther King Jr. getting involved in the movement as well. This is where he begins to gain some of his popularity. I mean, it gets to a point where in the bus boycott, because King has taken such a radical stance, allegedly radical in quotation marks, that it leads to the bombing of his house. In addition, it leads to the bombing of one of the other leaders' houses. It's just absolute mayhem. But again, this is kind of what we're seeing is these people taking these steps regardless of their own safety, their family's safety. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. had some young kids in the house. His wife Coretta's there, and these attacks are occurring. So it's not like there's not pushback, but it is like we are seeing people who are truly fighting for something they believe is important. But again, you'll notice like we are going like 1954, 1955. Now we're all the way to 1963, and they still are not at a point where we are seeing the changes that need to occur. They are somewhat happening at the state level. The Montgomery bus boycott does lead to some changes in busing policies within the state. It leads to some desegregation policies as well at the state level. Um, So in 1963, you have the Birmingham marches led by the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or Leadership Committee. I can't remember if it's conference or committee. Regardless, they worked with another group in Alabama to sort of organize marches, sit-ins, boycotts of local businesses. Um, this leads to people, the state of Alabama and the city of Birmingham, to put out policies that prevent people from meeting in large places, that prevent people from protesting, using their First Amendment rights. So, amongst others, Martin Luther King Jr. gets arrested. And while in jail, he writes a letter from the Birmingham jail. You guys are going to read it. You guys have some questions regarding that. That's up on Classroom right now. But again, we should be thinking about the idea of the natural law. This constitutional principle, this foundational principle that we hold uh, so dearly. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. is sort of talking about as he makes his argument. So, a quote from there: "One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly and lovingly." I think that's just a wonderful quote to think about. So we get in 1964, 1965, we finally see the Civil Rights Act pass in 1964, which basically the Civil Rights Act is the official national law that outlaws segregation. So we went from 1954, where the Supreme Court sort of said, hey, we can't segregate, to 1964, 10 years later. That's 2.5 presidencies, right? Later, where we begin to see action take place. Where we begin to see desegregation finally, happen. And this is where that other shoe drops. Schools who do not desegregate are not given money. They're withheld the grants that would be offered them normally from the federal level. So we also see in 1965, and this is 1965 is crazy. This is where Selma happens. The march from Selma to Montgomery. That march, and again, the movie Selma is an incredible movie. Go out, watch it. It's awesome. It's powerful. And I've also included for you on Classroom a link to another. That one deals more with desegregation, but a documentary series, We Shall Overcome. It's an incredible documentary series. I can't recommend you watch that enough. Um, but again, the Voting Rights Act is passed, which this is emphasizing the outlawing of literacy tests. And if you are living in an area that is being, let's say, uncooperative, the Justice Department can come in and help get people registered to vote and protect their rights to vote. It's really, really an important piece of legislation that is passed. But again, we're talking 10 years, bloodshed, murder, uh, arrests. We are talking about an incredibly long fight for freedom. And I would say that even in 65, we're not technically seeing um, the results that I think people wanted to see. I mean, this is a long term fight. And some people would argue that even to this day, we are fighting some of the remnants of what happens when these things occur. So, um, that is, we've definitely touched on all of those different policies, all of those, or excuse me, not policies, those main ideas that we talked about originally, like explaining how constitutional provisions have supported or motivated social groups, right? We talked about the 14th Amendment. We talked about how important that was. How has the government responded? Well, we've seen that as well, right? And then number three, explain how the Supreme Court has allowed restrictions of civil rights of minority groups, but at the other time, it's also protected them. I hope that you guys all saw that as well. To move on quickly here, to just touch on these women's rights, those sort of have been fought for from the beginning. Now, as westward movement happened in the 1800s, some of those Western states were giving women rights earlier. You had states out in like Montana and Nevada and Colorado and those areas who realized that in order to successfully colonize the West, you needed to have women on board as well. So you saw some states advocating for women's right to vote, but we don't actually see that until 1920, after a bunch of women were arrested outside of the White House for protesting because they didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to decide whether or not we were going to enter into World War One. They didn't have the right to talk about anything really at the civil level, like at our governmental level. So we do see some really important changes there. Um, So when we see the Civil Rights Act that's passed in 1964, we also see that addressing gender and sex. So that is an important thing to consider. That means that women can't be, you can't get a job because you're a woman. Like there needs to be more to that than just your gender or your sex. And we also see that in Higher Education Act of 1972 with Title IX, which basically means that if that females need to be provided with the same opportunity as male students, or all students. Really, let's just put it that way. Like all students need to be provided the same chance. So if there's not a softball team, you can play baseball, right? Like it's one of those. I mean, that's the simplest way to look at it. There has been an equal rights amendment that's fought for. I'll let you do a little more research on that, but it has never passed. It seems absurd to me, but the idea being that it would finally put, other than their right to vote, it would finally put the women's rights into the constitutional wording. So your task now, what I've asked you to do, one other thing that we need to consider is this idea of affirmative action, right? Affirmative action is the idea of the government trying to fight against race and trying to help a minority group or many minority groups, right? And you have a couple of important cases here. The University of California case is an interesting one because Bach, whatever his name is, I don't know what the pronunciation is. But he's actually not admitted to the University of California primarily because he's white. This was a while ago. I can't remember exactly when the date of the case was. I think it was in the 1970s. Not positive, but this guy was, ex-military. He was, had really incredible grades, and his resume was awesome. But basically, what the court system says is like, let him in because he's obviously a great candidate. He shouldn't be discriminated against either. But it also makes sense that if there are a limited number of entries and you as a college want to diversify your campus and provide people who aren't provided with the same opportunities and opportunity to succeed, then you should open up your doors and sort of let them in as well. Because maybe they didn't have the same opportunities that some of these other people from wealthier areas or people who are more highly represented on college campuses had. Um, I think today it's really, really interesting. So what I want you to do is I want you to visit this website. It's NPR, but basically this is a really important case that's going on right now. And there's right now it's actually turned into this whole thing where um, we are finding that colleges are having to refuse um, applicants from Asian American areas because they are becoming overrepresented. Um, so a lot of Asia there's a lot of feelings of discrimination against people from China, people and people from other Asian nations. So I think that there's an important thing here into having this discussion of, do you believe that affirmative action programs either further racial equality, or do they serve a purpose, or do you think that they end up in sort of supporting this idea of quote unquote reverse racism, where like you're trying to be fair, but in trying to be fair, you're actually limiting the opportunities of other people. So thanks for coming in and joining me today. I really appreciate your time. I'll be adding this to Classroom so that you can see it. It'll be an assignment for you. We managed to do this in about 23 minutes, which is awesome. I hope that you are all doing incredibly well. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me in any way that you know how. All right. Bat Signal works. Twitter works. Facebook, Instagram, email, whatever. Take care of yourselves. Have a good one.